All right, we're back with a deep dive into Marc Gafni, Aubrey Marcus's mentor or quote unquote esteemed teacher, who seems to be behind this idea of radical monogamy, rebranding of poly as monogamy, and this idea of the evolution of love. So, we're going to dive deep into this. Who is he? And what is the true agenda behind his evolution of love? Because he seems to be a bit of a murky character. And a number of people who watched my first video, deep diving into that whole podcast episode that has created quite a stir in the spiritual awakened community, about poly, this idea of radical monogamy, but really it's so much deeper, right? A few people commented the links to his background, and I had heard a little bit here and there that he has a definitely questionable background. So, number one, why is Aubrey Marcus choosing him to be his mentor through this process? Because it's actually related to sexual abuse and assault allegations. Never convicted, to be really clear, but we're going to get deeper into that. But I also want to anchor this in because this is so much bigger than these allegations. This is so much bigger than the idea of poly. So we're going to dive deeper into the archetype that he represents, this false priesthood archetype, and the dark agendas that drive it. So, is this truly an evolution of love, or is it glamorizing spiritual abuse? Now, I did some research behind this, and I have a lot of notes for this one, so I might be doing a bit more reading for this episode because I really want to make sure it's grounded in the facts, number one. Number two, that I really cover all the bases of what this is about. And before I get any deeper, I want to also anchor in that the next episode, we're going to counterbalance this kind of heavier, darker energy with very, very pure, exquisite energy with the interview that I'm going to be sharing on the actual podcast with my mentor who teaches true divine union. And her frequency is just really, really incredibly beautiful. So that will be coming next, and it will be a beautiful counterbalance and juxtaposition for this energy versus that, because a lot of people could just feel into his energy without even knowing his background, and it gave them the ick. His energy gave them the ick. And people who actually know his background, there seems to be potentially a much more sinister energy underlying this whole conversation. So we're going to go deeper because this is not at all about drama or personal choices. This is a really crucial conversation for spiritual sovereignty, those on the path of deep mastery and sovereignty. These are crucial conversations for us to be having. And yesterday was actually Joan of Arc Day, the anniversary of her persecution, of her being burned at the stake. And I don't think the timing of all of this is accidental. Saturn just went into Aries this past week as well, signifying a 30-year completion, a cycle completion. And it really brings a new energy of leadership. So changing of the guard, I didn't even get into the astrological aspect in my last couple of videos, but for those who do follow that, this is right in line. And the Grail Queen energy is rising. The Grail codes are rising. Joan of Arc was a voice of truth. And just as she was a voice of truth, this conversation is about truth with a capital T, not distorted ego truth, and the protection of the sacred, which is love. Love is sacred. And the guarding of the rising of the Christ Sophia codes, of the true divine union coding. So we're going to get into all these different layers of what the false priesthood is, the archontic energy, Gaffne's own background, and we're going to really tie it into a even deeper conversation that I was beginning to see based on a couple comments that added an actual disturbing lens to it. And I'm not associating this with Gaffney himself, to be clear, but that knowing that there are energies that can run through people, dark energies, demonic energies, even without their conscious awareness in many cases, but knowing that these energies can use people as vessels for these deeper, darker agendas, I think we need to get into it. So I almost don't even want to talk about it because it's that dark and yucky, but we're talking about not just poly, but the reality, because children were brought into the conversation numerous times, okay? And I received, I'm just going to kind of lay the foundation now. Somebody commented on my Facebook post before I even shared YouTube videos that she had grown up in poly, and there was often, and so had her husband, so they're clearing this from the lineage. There was a lot of trauma and a lot of damage on both sides, but they're doing the deep work. They're doing the hard work. I'm getting so many chills of clearing these patterns from the lineage because it was so traumatic for them. But it was not just poly, it was pedophilia. And she said the two often go hand in hand. And I am not saying that, Gaffney is a part of if there is a connection. If there is, I'm asking questions, right? I'm asking questions. Could there be something deeper at play here? So this is also a conversation about how spiritual predators weaponize sacred language to groom both individuals and collective consciousness. So it seemed to me this idea of the grooming of the collective consciousness came through. It seemed to me that there was this grooming taking place, attempted grooming, to distort the most sacred thing of all, which is love, and to distort the idea of divine truth. So distorted masculine, distorted feminine energies coming together to distort the very idea of sacred union, which is the most sacred template on the planet. The Holy Grail union is the most sacred divine template that exists. So this is the exact pattern these false priesthood characters, these archetypes run, okay? So using spiritual evolution language to justify this idea of a boundary collapse, which is what we were really seeing with Violana, having her boundaries pushed over and over and over again. And then gaslighted to the point where she's gaslighting herself into believing that this is evolution. This is growth. This is expansion. And it's really co-opting the sacred union language to progressively, over time, desensitize the collective to what is really happening, which is not sacred. And, let's just be real. This is simply a rebranding of poly as radical monogamy. This is 1984 doublespeak going on here. And he seems to have a history of doing this, Gaffney himself. So one of his books, please don't buy his books. One of his books, Mad Love, When Madness Becomes Sanity. When Madness Becomes Sanity. That right there is a red flag. Normalizing madness, normalizing sickness, okay? So, he has this quotation, we want to love wide and we want to love deep and we want to love big. So it's just but what does he really mean by that? So he's using this language of love, which is beautiful and divine and sacred and something that we all desire, and intimacy. And he's completely distorting it, but using such flowery language that a lot of people who are not anchored in their own truth, who do not trust their own truth, are going to hear this and potentially go into a space of contemplation and confusion about what they thought to be true for themselves. As I got into in that first video that I did on this subject. So this is, grooming through this whole idea of radical love, this rhetoric that's slowly leading toward a normalization of these distorted, potentially, age boundaries as well, because that is his checkered history, which I'll get into. And, potentially sexual inversions on all levels. So it's very, very important when we're dealing with these public figures. He's on very public platforms. He's even got a Wikipedia page. They're weaponizing spiritual language while carrying deeply, deeply fractured or even predatory frequencies in their field, right? So I did a little digging into this, and I found a really interesting article, which I will quote in a moment, and I'll link the resources below, because one of the videos that I was told, guided to watch, was an interview with his third wife, and it did not do him any favors. So we can see that, there's this kind of dissociative field if you can actually feel into the energy, but it's this smoothed over vocabulary that is meant to deliberately disarm and confuse through this subtle manipulation that comes through this beautiful language, poetic wording, right? So it also creates this kind of cognitive gymnastics, radical monogamy, madness becoming sanity, right? You're like, oh my gosh, is this just like incredibly profound wisdom that I am just not anchored in? Like, maybe I need to listen to what he has to say, because maybe I've been seeing everything all wrong, right? So this is a classic trait of narcissistic manipulation, and it's really justifying harm under the banner of evolution or new models of love, potentially control, victim blaming, but also victim posturing. We'll see, that he does a lot of that. After the allegations, he postured himself to be the victim, of course. So reframing abuse as consensual, or even beneficial. So basically, he's playing on people's desires for intimacy in this very broken world of relationships, this broken world of disconnection, where, he said there's hundreds of millions of people going to sleep alone every night, and sex is love in the body at its best. He's conflating sex and love. Sex can be an incredibly divine expression of love when it's between two consensual adults. In Hieros-Gamos union in particular, it is a profoundly activating act of alchemy. And when done from the lower chakras, it can obviously be done outside of the realm of love. Sex is not love. Let's be very clear about that. The two are entirely distinct. Can the two go hand in hand? 100%. The two are not the same, though. So he also says no one who doesn't want to should be going to sleep alone. He's committed to a world where there are no more lonely people, and which every man and woman and child actually has a seat at the table. And while at first glance that sounds beautiful, nobody, feeling lonely, because there is a loneliness epidemic going on for sure. People are having relationships with their chat GPT. This is a problem in society at large. But what is the solution? He's focusing on the bed. He's focusing on sex. And then he weaves in the wording of you adding children into the mix every now and again. And it gives off a little bit of a creepy vibe when you're really tuning into it. So these are questions of truth, trust, integrity, ethics, wisdom, service to God for the greater good of humanity. All words and terms that he used in the conversation. And so you can see how the subtle distortion and the subtle archontic thought forms are being implanted into the collective by couching it in these terms, in this language. So energetically speaking, beings like this often run on these archontic or fallen priesthood currents, right? So it's linked to this inverted sexual power and predatory structures. So when we go back to ancient Egypt, this is where a lot of the fallen priesthood energy anchored in this civilization. And, it's giving ancient dark priesthood, ancient Egyptian dark priesthood vibes, as well as dark Atlantean priestess vibes, but it's really giving Jafar from Aladdin, the Grand Vizier, who is like straight up an evil sorcerer, right? That is literally the visual that came to mind. So while Aubrey Marcus can be seen as kind of like a false king archetype in the spiritual community, Marc Gafni would be the false dark priest, the grand vizier type energy. So the wise counsel that's actually not so wise, but completely distorted. So, they often have these sociopathic masking layers, allowing them to evade legal consequences, as it seems he has done every time, while maintaining spiritual followings. It's incredible to me that anybody still gives him a platform or gives him the time of day. They also feed energetically on the innocence and idealism of those who are genuinely seeking truth. And this is the trap for so many people, because so many are awakening. So many are seeking higher truth. They're seeing the collapsing of the matrix, questioning what's real, what's not, and opening up to these new ideas and possibilities. And somebody who's newer on the path may come across figures like this and be like, oh my gosh, he sounds so wise. This is a revolutionary, evolutionary way of looking at things. Well, shoot, my past relationships haven't worked. Maybe he's completely right. I'm heartbroken over my last relationship where they cheated on me. Maybe we're not meant to only have one person in our life. But if you read comments from anybody who's actually been in a polyamorous or polygamous relationship, it never goes well. The feedback across the board is not good. I found one comment that I wanted to highlight. I was poly, so this is a comment that I saw on actually a Jordan Peterson video. I'll share that below. Yeah, interesting. I sent it to myself at 3:33, and that was 33 minutes ago. I had to add that in. Someone told me not to add the numbers when I speak, but I can't help but notice them sometimes. So my thought in starting it, I was poly for 7 or 8 years. My thought in starting it was that loving someone should include respecting their freedom to love, which is a huge topic that they brought into the conversation, freedom, and explore with others, and insisting upon the same freedom for myself. I believed love should have no boundaries. It's nice in theory, but in reality, it was heart-wrenching and exhausting. We could see that exhaustion in Vailana's field in particular, right? So continuing. I was idealistic and overconfident in my ability to manage multiple relationships. It had its advantages and fun, cool feelings at times, but was completely unsustainable. Relationships took over my life. I had no time for anything else. My personal goals fell by the wayside. I felt I was above jealousy and insecurity. Ha! When you get to the point of really loving someone, then somebody else steps into the picture and starts sleeping with them. It's gut-wrenching for anyone with feelings. Polyamory is a lifestyle that can work for hedonistic psychopaths, not my words, who view relationships as a means to sexual gratification. But for normal people, you will encounter the demons in yourself and in your lovers in a matter of time. Do not recommend in caps. So that's honest feedback from somebody who was in a poly dynamic for 7 to 8 years, which is not a short amount of time. Aubrey himself said that poly, kind of destroyed him in the past, but here he goes again. So it's like, okay, is he even in control of himself, or is there another energy working through him? So, Marc Gafni really is not a unique character. He's not individual. He's not radical or evolutionary or revolutionary. He represents a type that appears repeatedly at key moments during collective spiritual awakenings throughout the course of history. This character type will come into play, right? I don't even like talking about him. I don't even like giving him airtime, but this is such an important conversation to have. And he happens to be the representation that is tangible right now for us to really, dive deep into these ideas and see the archetype in action, in play, right? So these figures attempt to co-opt the return of the Christ Sophia by inserting these subtle distortions, particularly around sacred union, sexuality and freedom, power dynamics, divine embodiment. So embodiment is really the key, and they were using a lot of terminology that was connected to the divine and to God and stuff like that. And I did check back because I wanted to find a particular spot that I kind of remembered something he said, but I couldn't. So I tried to go through the transcript of the conversation, and I pulled up the video again reluctantly. And Aubrey had completely, or his team had completely updated the caption, the description, and he was like, oh, we're not trying to pose in any particular way, but it was really interesting. They tried to backtrack slightly on some of what they were, saying in the video, ever so slightly, but it was done in such a careful manner that, this is how distortion works. They didn't say you should follow our model, but then they propose it as a revolutionary, evolutionary new template for sacred relationship. Okay, that's planting some serious seeds right there. So it's basically controlled inversion of truth and sacredness, whether it's consciously orchestrated or simply, just kind of an extension of their own unintegrated shadow. That's also a question. I am not suggesting, to be very clear, I am not suggesting that they're doing all of this completely consciously, that these darker agendas that are at play, that's the undercurrent underlying this conversation. I'm not suggesting that both, either one or both are completely conscious of what they're doing. It could be that they're completely delusional and completely convinced that what they're doing is sacred. That because they're operating through their shadow selves, that they really genuinely believe this is a great service to humanity and the evolution of love. So yes, let's get into the false priesthood archetype a little bit more deeply. So it's cloaked in spiritual language is one of the hallmarks. So here we go. And inversion of true sacred union. Again, this is something we've, reiterated over and over. It's an inversion of true sacred hieros gamos union, which begins within, above all, but they're sexualizing it, externalizing it first and foremost. So right there, we see a distortion in the narrative around sacred union. And it's this idea of grooming through glamour, not just sex, but this kind of glamorization of it's performative. It's very performative, right? And this kind of intellectual seduction. I mean, listen, if you listen to their words, it sounds so intellectual, so esoteric that it can be easy to be taken in by the poetic language and the intellectual fluidity of the words that they speak, that it draws you in and you're like, oh my gosh, what they're saying is so profound. I want to hear more. Tell me more. And that's how they hook people in, right? So there's also this kind of gatekeeper dynamic. They position themselves as the initiator, as the guide, as the one who's creating this new template, this new evolution. So, this is not new, though. It's happened many times in history. I mean, we've seen poly over and over again. Poly in the name of God. God told me to do this, right? So there's this kind of charismatic charm that comes through a lot of them because they have this manipulative energy running through them, this mystical language as well. So they also will weaponize the sacred language to disarm people energetically, emotionally, intellectually. And sexual boundary violations will be reframed as an initiation or a liberation, even a liberation from the potential like box that somebody might have been keeping themselves in according to that structure. I experienced that to a degree, not as overtly sexual, but when I was in a medicine ceremony, a mushroom ceremony with this medicine man, he really, that's a whole story for another time. And I kind of got into it in one of the previous episodes, but he really pushed my boundaries and was making it seem like I was operating in fear. And it was really gross. And I saw his eyes change. It was dark AF. And he was a former of, in that pyramid, the 32nd. Yeah. So they will position themselves as an irreplaceable guide, teacher, or key holder a lot of the time. Many of us are key holders, but it's not from a space of hierarchy. So, I just want to be really clear about that as well. Many of us who hold the true templates and the true codes have keys and have things that we're here to help open within the collective, but we're not positioning ourselves in a space of, hierarchy and needing, it's like we're doing our best to put these keys out into the collective field through not necessarily with a gatekeeper in place, if that makes sense. They also will lack true accountability, and they will always make themselves the victim of a smear campaign. They'll say it's a smear campaign if there are allegations against them, which I'm going to get into his full history. They followed him everywhere he went. So they attract broken masculine or feminine souls who are seeking healing and union, but it's really to siphon them. Again, as I mentioned in the previous video, like all the healing loops that people are trapped in this new age mentality, especially with plant medicine, okay? Plant medicine can be used in a very integrated manner. And I actually interviewed a woman last month. I published the episode with her on my podcast about her experience with ayahuasca and plants, but not just plant medicine. She literally has a plant garden. So she has a very deep and sacred connection with plants as pollinators, she has a food garden, but she's also worked with them intimately in a sacred container as medicine. When you do it with a space of integrity, it's an entirely different conversation. But many people go into ceremony after ceremony after ceremony without integrating. And so this is a key distinction here, because that kind of manner of using it just creates openings for these darker energies to keep siphoning off of. So I've mentioned the word archontic a couple times. So archon is an ancient Greek term that means ruler, authority, or lord. So it's kind of like these darker ruling energies. But also in the Gnostic cosmology, the archons are non-organic, parasitic, inorganic entities that exist outside of the stream of source creation, so they cannot generate their own energy. They're not creator beings. They cannot generate unto themselves. They need to hijack from other beings. They need to siphon from other beings, and there's a lot of mind control and mind parasites. So I mentioned these negative thought forms going into the collective to keep people trapped in these frequency fences, in these thought patterns, in these karmic loops that are not going to serve them evolutionarily speaking, actually. So they feed off of control, deception, distortion, manipulation of organic souls, people who are on the organic ascension path. So their ultimate goal is to prevent the rise of embodied Christos Sophia consciousness in humanity. They can't create unto themselves, but they are total masters at manipulation, inversion, and mimicry of the sacred. So for those who are uninitiated, who don't have the discernment in place, they will be seen as these very spiritual beings that, have a lot of wisdom to share, but they're mimicking the true light. That's why we call it false light. They insert false teachings that sound true but contain subtle distortions, and they're at the heart of false light structures, inverted hierarchies, AI timelines as well, and soul harvesting systems. So, huge red flags if anybody's talking about, putting in chips and stuff like that, right? I definitely don't trust anybody who's on that transhuman timeline or pushing it. So in more simple terms, it's basically this archontic is this inverted authority based on control, deception, and parasitic feeding off of life force energy, which is your classic narcissist, energy vampire, whatever terms you want to use. So they, again, thrive on this hierarchical false priesthood system. They thrive on false spiritual gurus and false cult leaders. So we can see that very much come into play in this conversation. They also thrive off of sexual energy inversion. So it's like the harvesting energy of sacred codes, of sacred innocence and purity. And how many times did they bring up purity into the conversation? The archontic energy also thrives off of fear-based religion, shame, unworthiness programming, disempowerment disguised as enlightenment. I mean, basically, we're describing the entire New Age movement as well as the entire patriarchal religious system that has been in place for millennia. And so this is what humanity is breaking free from. And this is why they're trying to hijack the awakening and ascension, because our consciousness is ascending out of these paradigms, out of these dynamics of control and hierarchy, and we're stepping into sovereignty. And once we do that, they have nothing to feed off of anymore. And this, again, is why these conversations are so important. So as the Christos Sophia returns and is being anchored in, and it's being done so even more palpably in the last several months, as I record this, these beings are basically acting as like gate crashers to the ascension. They want to keep people stuck. They want to keep the gates closed is probably a better way to look at it. So they're trying to redirect people off of the path of authentic union, Hieros Gamos, off of the path of authentic organic ascension. They're trying to insert distortions into the sacred union discourse and weaken the rising collective of priestesses, grid workers, teachers who are anchoring in the organic path. So, if we're speaking counter to that narrative, people might question us, right? Thank goodness it seems that the vast majority saw through that narrative. But, it's a very sophisticated operation that has been going on for millennia. So all religious structures have had this programming in place, honestly. So what is the antidote to this? And then I'll get into Gaffne himself. Full spectrum discernment, no bypassing red flags under the guise of non-judgment. Okay, yeah, let's bring judgment back, as I said in the previous video. A purity of heart and fierce clarity, bringing down that sword of truth, this Joan of Arc warrior energy, being a stand for divine truth above all, regardless of what the masses say, regardless of what the other authorities are accusing you of. You know what is true in your sacred heart of hearts, and that's what they're trying to confuse you out of. Standing in your sacred boundaries and returning to inner union first, external union secondarily, okay? So these are the antidotes to these archontic energies and entities and this false priesthood template that is embodied by this figure, Marc Gafni. So let's look at his history. So going back to the 1980s, there were allegations of sexual abuse with underage girls. And I will link the Wikipedia and whatever other resources I checked out on the YouTube video of the interview with his ex-wife. I will link those below so you can see that I'm not just pulling these out of nowhere. It's on Wikipedia as well, I believe. Yeah. I think I just said that. So in the 2000s, early 2000s, he went to Israel. This Bayit Hadash Center that he had started collapsed because of more allegations, and he had gone from New York to Boca Raton, and then he went to Israel, and allegations followed him everywhere he went. That he went to Esalen, there were allegations there, and somehow he always evaded any actual persecution. So okay, could it be all slander? Possibly. But why are these allegations following him everywhere he goes? Multiple countries, multiple different time zones, before the rise of social media. So if there's a pattern, we shouldn't ignore it, right? And when you can read energy, you can also see that there is something going on there. There is a history of him blaming the victim and turning around the narrative. He gets out of it often, apparently, by blackmailing or convincing others to view him as the victim, to view the victims as the perpetrators themselves, that he's being slandered, as this cult guru type figure, a spiritual leader, not cult, because he's not a cult leader. But, there's also a history of underage girls in the mix here. So there's a history of sexual misconduct. He was fired. There were scandals in his workplaces, multiple. There were further allegations and a public response in 2015 to 2016. The New York Times there's a New York Times article published that revisited all the allegations, and then 100 rabbis signed a petition denouncing him, basically, including some spiritual leaders. So now he's not in the Jewish world as much as the spiritual world, but he's positioned himself still as a spiritual leader and thought leader and whatever else. But he was also named in another lawsuit in 2019 filed under New York's Child Victims Act. So there was a plaintiff alleged that he sexually abused her when she was 16 during his own tenure at Yeshiva University's Jewish Public School Youth Program. So the lawsuit named Yeshiva University as a defendant. Okay, this is all just public record. These allegations are out there. There was never a criminal persecution, to be very clear. So he had to return his Orthodox rabbinical ordination in 2004 following a lot of these initial allegations. His ordination from the Jewish Renewal Movement was also revoked. Several organizations and individuals severed ties with him in light of the allegations. Like Esalen canceled a planned workshop, and public denials. Basically, Gaffne himself has consistently denied all these allegations. But when there's a pattern, at what point do we say, oh, it's just coincidence, right? So I did a little digging, like I said earlier, and I found this. There's not that much research. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of bridge a little bit. So this idea of grooming the collective we've kind of gotten into, but what is it grooming the collective for? Polyamory, rebranded as monogamy, of course, because now, doublespeak is normalized. But is polyamory a grooming gateway for something even deeper, possibly, beyond just a spiritual bypass around true sacred union? Maybe, could there be a progressive desensitization strategy going on here? Open relationships then leads to multiple partners, then leads to consensual liberation, then leads to potentially, not Gaffney, but just generally, Are these energies, trying to seed this potential grooming and desensitization for the blurring then of age boundaries? Ultimately, then, normalizing pedophilia in collective consciousness. This is where the danger lies. Again, this is about the archontic energies working through, the archontic inversion working through potentially unconscious vessels. But this is why it struck a nerve with so many, not because people were judging the construct of polyamory, but because it was being positioned as sacred union, a new template for love, an evolution of love where nobody goes to bed alone, not even children. It was weird. It was weird the way it was positioned. So again, I found there's not that much research on pedophilia and poly being linked, okay? We know there are issues with polygamy. We know there are, just poly never really works out. But children, what about the children, right? Did they ever consider the repercussions and consequences for the children if they were raised in the dynamic? Because if we look at all the anecdotal evidence at the very least, these situations never really work well for the children. The children wind up traumatized or having severe issues down the road. The ones who speak up and say, when I grew up in this dynamic, they never have good feedback about it. They say, please don't. This is anecdotal on my behalf anyway. I didn't dig for hours and hours, but I did find this Guru Pedophiles, Not Neo-Polygamists and Predatory Prophets article, exploring the sex scandals and abuse allegations concerning cults. So they looked at reviews from 1993 to 2017. I'm not going to dig deep into it, but they had categorized these different, profiles of the cult leaders and their different sexual proclivities. So there's the self-confessed pedophile, there's the traditional polygamist, there's the sex magician, the lapsed monk. They had their vows and then they just couldn't control themselves anymore. And then the undiscriminating womanizer and the unwitting target. So if anybody wants to, so that's the one who, they position themselves as the victim. So if anybody wants to go deeper, I will link that article below. There's not a whole lot of literature, formal literature looking at these different dynamics. So I think these collective conversations, for that reason, actually need to happen more. What are the consequences for the children above all? Why are they not considering these consequences more seriously? Raising children in that dynamic. Why aren't they talking about that? Why aren't they digging into that? Is more the focus on the sacrifices they're making. But let's be honest, going back to that comment that I read, there is no time for them to have any other energy for their personal passions, pursuits, anything outside of the relationship dynamic. So what's really going on here with this poly agenda? Are they really going to fulfill their soul mission beyond the relational template if they're caught up in these very confusing and exhausting dynamics of managing multiple partners in a relationship? Because it's hard enough with one person. If we haven't figured out monogamy, what makes us think? What kind of hubris is underlying the idea that we could figure out multiple partners and make it work for the children in a healthy manner? I mean, my goodness, it's beyond ridiculous, honestly. So is there a direct equivalence between poly and pedophilia? Formally speaking, there is not. To be very, 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 very clear, there is not. However, there are common spiritual distortion fields underlying them that often link or feed both. So, there can be certain energetic dynamics present in both dynamics. I am certainly not suggesting right now that people who engage in poly are across the board susceptible to this or have these proclivities in them. Absolutely not. I am absolutely not saying that. But I'm saying in the way that this conversation was positioned and presented, and the way that people gave me this specific feedback directly, I think this is a conversation that needs to be surfaced. Are there deeper undercurrents underlying this desensitization and this collective grooming of the consciousness around evolutionary love templates, revolutionary relational templates? Could there be something deeper and potentially more sinister underlying the conversation? So again, there's this often in poly, there are unintegrated wounds, especially fear of intimacy, abandonment, or power dynamics. So poly becomes then a spiritual bypass, right? There's this shadow masculinity expressing itself as sacred liberation. There's this addiction to novelty, stimulation, or validation as well for the ego-based, obviously. And in extreme forms, it can absolutely erode devotional sacred union codes, and it can open the doorway to deeper distortion templates where sexuality is then divorced from spiritual alignment. So sex itself can be a deeply, deeply sacred act. Sexual alchemy can be a profoundly powerful experience to facilitate ascension. And it can be completely inverted and distorted, as we have seen. And this is what the lunar version of Isis does. So because he brought up Isis as, the god that told him that he was meant to have children with both women. Okay, yeah. So pedophilia then, separate, but we're going to look at the distortions that can underlie it. It's a profound inversion of sacred sexuality and the original Grail codes. Like, disgusting. I mean, I just have no comprehension of it because it's vile. It makes me nauseous, and I don't get nauseous. Like, I have a strong stomach. That is not something that I experience. Rather than being about love, it's about control, life force siphoning, power dynamics. It is disgusting, but they're siphoning the innocence, the purity. I'm not going to get so deep into the more insidious layers of the collective, the kind of satanic energies underlying a lot of the people in the spotlight too much, but we know that they target children because their life force energy is so pure, it gives them the most fuel, right? So many dark occult systems link this directly to the harvesting of innocence and purity. I got ahead of myself. Frequencies, feeding inverted grids, particularly the lunar distortion. So there will be ritual and ceremony around the siphoning of the children's energy, the harvesting of their energy, right? And this often connects to fallen seraphic lineages as well. There's an interfacing with fallen AI or archontic consciousness that preys upon weakened, fragmented souls, right? So if you have distortions in your field or fragmentation or portals, slits, openings because of wounding, of trauma from your past, you're more likely to have openings that they can get into and kind of take over and then harvest you to be a vessel for this energy as well, or to harvest the energy of the weakened vessel. So people who have deep trauma, especially sexual trauma, they're much more liable to have repeated experiences because their field is collapsed. Their field is already compromised, and they can be siphoned from and manipulated and controlled that much more easily. So is there a bridge between the two? that, there are some similar distortion currents that influence extreme poly that can exist in the circles where the sexual boundaries are pushed under the guise of expansion and spiritual evolution and non-judgmental exploration and stuff like that. And the ultimate goal of the shadow is to break natural boundaries down, to break the field of sovereignty down. So there's, again, this blurring of the masculine feminine polarity. There's the erasure of age boundaries. Oh, she consented because she was 14, but he was 19. The first relationship, he was 19, she was 14. That is a freshman in high school with a sophomore in college. Is that not creepy? Maybe she was consensual, but how much was there manipulation going on in the undercurrent of how that dynamic began in the first place? Was she really consensual? So erasing consent through spiritualized language, normalizing energy harvesting through dissociation, dissolving the holiness of the sexual current and the body temple. So this is where those kind of underground elite things, the poly, group sex, child abuse, they can kind of coexist. Do they always go hand in hand? No, I'm absolutely not saying that. I'm not suggesting any particular individual in this conversation would have crossed that boundary themselves. I'm suggesting that there are deeper undercurrents underlying this conversation. Not because they equal each other, but because it can become a doorway. Progressive desensitization to boundary violation. So the most dangerous form of manipulation is spiritualized language being used to weaponize and bypass boundaries, honestly. All love is divine. There's no age in the soul, right? Attachment is pure ego. So jealousy is pure ego. Jealousy means that you haven't transcended your ego. Innocence is repression. We've got to liberate your life force energy. When you think about it, it's really, really dark and distorted. So this is really common in distorted tantra and cult circles and certain new age poly subcultures, and they become gateways, entry points for much, much darker dynamics. And again, I'm not suggesting that all tantra is a gateway. Some of it is done in a sacred manner, but it has been co-opted by many. So the root distortion here is the Luciferian inversion of sacred union and the fallen Saturnian priesthoods that controlled sexuality for power purposes, to siphon, to control, to manipulate. So this is also fundamentally a hijacking of the Christ Sophia codes. This is really, the most fundamental distortion at play here. What was meant to be co-creative union becomes then energy harvesting and inversion rituals. So this is what keeps the dark energies in power. And this is why so many were seeing through it. And this is why it's beautiful. Oh, it's beautiful how many people were seeing through it, because we're reclaiming our voices. We're reclaiming our truth. We're seeing through it because the Christ Sophia codes are being anchored in. We are wisening up. We are holding firm and standing firm in our boundaries, in our sacred boundaries, in our sacred sovereignty, and saying no. No more to these distortions, no more to this control and manipulation, this paradigm of power over, of hierarchy, of siphoning. No more. We're done with it. Bye-bye. Saturn just moved into Aries. This is a whole new era because Aries represents the first of the zodiac, the first one, and it is leadership. It is a new era. We're now in, Pluto in Aquarius. It's a whole different dynamic going on a lot of different levels. But beyond the astrology, the Christ Sophia frequencies are being anchored in. Aurora Earth is rising, and the Holy Father and the Holy Mother frequencies are rising. So Again, the antidote is to return to these devotional sacred union templates, to restore the womb and the heart as sovereign templates, to teach true energetic sovereignty, to refuse to bypass under the guise of spiritual progressivism, to hold compassionate but non-negotiable boundaries. This is my sacred no. And allow that to really permeate your field and all of your teachings and your life in general. Having that sacred no is powerful when it comes not just to sexual relationships, but any energies that are trying to siphon and harvest off of your purity, to keep you out of mission, to keep you out of your own sovereignty, and to siphon you from multiple different directions and manners, perhaps in family dynamics, in friendship dynamics, in business and purpose dynamics as well. So discernment is absolutely key, right? So sacred union is not boundless polyamory. It is not constant spiritual experimentation. It is not bypassing emotional responsibility. It is the path of profound sacred responsibility, of profound sovereignty, of deep mastery. Mastery above all. And mastery is what guides us into inner union, hieros gamos within, sacred union within, so that it can manifest without and create that beautiful co-created relational template of sacred union, so that we can actually heal the relational templates, so that we can raise children in a frequency of love, so that these traumas are not passed down through the generations any longer, so that the future generations, within even one or two, we can actually heal the planet and bring everyone into the frequency of true divine love, sacred love, actual sacred love, not through these distorted evolution of love templates, but through true sacred hieros gamos union templates, birthing a co-created divine being of love. This is why this is so important. This is why these conversations are so important. So true sacred union is devotion, it is stability, it is safety, it is embodied polarity and mutual sovereignty. It is embodied harmony, so that there is harmony within the relationship container. There are red flags for false priesthood to look out for as well, so to look out for this infiltration into spiritual circles. And we've got to actually look at the dark mother dynamics again as well, but that's a whole other video. This is already long. So intellectualized justification of boundary collapse, over complex relationship models, huge red flag, false humility masking as manipulative seduction. I'm just doing this in the name of love. I'm sacrificing in the name of collective evolution of consciousness. No. So again, this is not judging a relationship pattern, a relationship choice, a personal choice. It's about protecting the sacred. It's about protecting the sacredness of the language that we use. There is a spiritual science and it is being hijacked. So we are witnessing the return of the Christ Sophia, and that's why we are also witnessing in turn the rise of these archontic energies and entities more publicly in the collective, because honestly, they're desperate and grasping at straws. They're using vessels to put these ideas out there for a final attempt to distort the path, to get people off the path, to loosh as many people and keep them in the frequency traps and the false ascension pathways, so that not as many souls anchor in the organic ascension. But guess what? It's already done. The restoration of Edenic templates is what is truly occurring. This is what we are witnessing and experiencing. And again, this is why they're desperate. And as the true guardians rise, we are witnessing the exposure, because truth and light illuminate the distortion and the darkness. And this is what we are seeing playing out in real time. So your discernment is not judgment. It is protection of the sacred. And this is what we need more of. People standing up in their sacred sovereignty and saying no to distortion and manipulation. We need people anchoring in the true Christ Sophia codes and expressing themselves as Grail warriors and speaking up, sharing their truth, embodying true divine love, embodying true sacred union, and stepping forward in their sacred sovereignty to express their purity, their spiritual purity, which we're going to get into in the next episode in more depth. The codes that came through for the podcast about divine union are exquisite. So please join us for that episode, which I publish all of my podcast episodes on Tuesdays, and all these other videos in between are just, offshoots of the conversations that need to be had, right? And different teachings that want to be shared. So thank you for being here. And again, if you want to go deeper, I have my book. I have I do have one-on-one. I've brought through a new process actually that's really deep, and we go deep really fast, and we're getting to the root, because if you're not getting to the root, what's the point? You're keeping yourself in a loop, in a cycle that's never going to close. So I do soul blueprint activations. I also have my soul blueprint embodiment masterclass to step into your spiritual sovereignty and embody your blueprint and reclaim your divine inheritance. And then I have Luminary, which is my deep dive path of transformation and soul remembrance, as well as anchoring in these multidimensional templates. So there's a lot there. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to me directly. I'm really appreciating the conversations in the comments and all of the really interesting feedback that I've been getting. So I really appreciate that, because your comments are really helping to shape these conversations and the direction of how I bring these teachings forth, because there's a lot to be said, but what is most relevant to the collective right now is this stuff. And you're helping me to anchor that in through the comments. So I really, really appreciate that. And I am sending you all so much love, true divine love. And I know that things are moving in the right direction. There's actually a lot more that I feel like it's not quite ready to say, but it's incredibly powerful what is anchoring into the grids right now. And I have a great deal of hope. So onward and upward in love and light, and I will see you in the next episode. Thank you so much for being here. All the likes, subscribes, comments are incredibly appreciated. Truly, I want to just make sure I don't know if I said that in the beginning, but I've just been really blown away by the feedback, and I've just been very motivated, but to get all of this out there, but just really, really humbled and in deep gratitude and appreciation. So thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you soon.